All right, we're going to carry on with our exploration of the Renaissance, beginning in 1400 on through about 1500. So to begin, let's go from painting to sculpture and looking at the artist Donatello. Donatello was really an innovator. You can see that in his David, which is a very non-traditional depiction of the classic figure who slew Goliath. Rather than showing David as a strong young man, here David is kind of delicate and is actually wearing a sort of foppish hat. In reality, this hat was a classic hat worn by peasants of the era. One of the things that I want you to notice about this particular statue is the way that it uses something called contrapposto. Contrapposto means like opposed. In other words, the lines of the shoulder and the lines of the hips are going in opposite directions. Let's look at a couple of more examples of this. Here we have another David that is more of our traditional view of the strong, young, athletic man who slew the giant. And it's also an illustration of how contrapposto works. This is Michelangelo's David. On the right here we have Doryphorus, or the spear bearer. And that's from the Golden Age of Greece. In looking at these two sculptures, it's really clear to see how the earlier Greeks influenced the artists of the Renaissance. And I think this is just a fine time to discuss nudity in the Renaissance, because that's something that we see a lot of in the art of the era. In the Middle Ages, there was none. It was considered blasphemous or disrespectful to show any nudity. And in the Renaissance, just as in the Greek era, there's quite a bit of it. In considering how nudity works in art, it's important to think about the society that produces the art. For example, in the Greek time and in the Renaissance, male nudes, totally cool. Female nudes, you probably won't see them in the Greek era. You will see them in the Renaissance, but here is the trick. A nude is acceptable, male or female, as long as it's from a mythological era. You don't see a nude that would be the lady who lived next door or a hired model from down the street. All nudes that are depicted depict a different time, a classical time, and that's what the rules were. Now let's look at today's era, where male nudes are pretty much non-existent, but partial female nudity is just a part of everyday life. So I thought I would just address that, because I think some of you might be a little taken aback by the nudes that we'll run across, but you know what? It's just a part of the art of the era. And as we go through, as we gallop through the history of art, you'll see that different societies and different times have different rules about this kind of convention. But more than anything else, remember, contrapposto means opposing lines of the shoulders and of the hips. Generally, the weight is on one leg and the head is turned at an angle. Let's look at one more work of Donatello's. This is one of my favorite works of art of all time. I do have a few, quite a few, but this one is such a beauty. Of course, she's not really beautiful. She's the penitent Magdalene, Mary Magdalene, who'd been in the desert for 40 years, praying and living on nothing but air. So she came back into society near the end of her life, clothed only in her own hair. And this is the sculpture. I said that Donatello was an innovator. And this is how this one is an innovation. Both this sculpture and the David that we just looked at are the first time that we see sculptures in the round since the Greek time. Well, the Roman time, actually, which came after. But all throughout the Middle Ages, there were no sculptures in the round, which means that you can walk all the way around them. But another really interesting innovation is that this is a wooden sculpture. Wood typically cracks with age, and yet we're looking at a sculpture that was made in the 1400s and still stands to this day. So what Donatello did was he hollowed it out, where where her hair forms sort of a dress around her body. Inside, it's hollow, which allowed the wood to breathe, to fluctuate with environmental changes. When I saw this at the Florence Cathedral Museum, I walked around a corner and it just took my breath away. Throughout the time I've been teaching art history, this has always been a piece that I've really loved. And to see it in person, to see how he crafted the pain and the devotion in this figure is really amazing. So let's see, who are we going to look at next here? Oh, speaking of the Florence Cathedral, this is a real masterwork. And I did climb to the top of the cathedral because in between the outside and the inside layer are stairs that wrap around. And you can climb all the way to the top and look out over the city of Florence and beyond. It was a real high point of my time in Florence, actually. So, how is this built? And how does this reflect the architecture of the time in general? So there was a simplicity of form that came into being during the Renaissance. Space is treated as something to be worked with rationally, according to what they called sacred geometry, which meant organizing elements in terms of a geometrical proportions that symbolized perfection. This is the first grand work of the Renaissance. And let's look a little further at how it was built. Oh, you know who built it? It's our friend Brunelleschi, the guy who didn't get the door commission. So instead of spending his life working on the door to the baptistry, which I believe you can see right here. If that's not it, it looks about like that. And that's where the doors, those bronze doors, are hung. But instead of doing that, Brunelleschi made this. This is really the first major dome. It's the largest of its size, and he kept his plans secret, and he worked on it for years. And what he did was he made an interior construction, and then you see here's the stairs. So as the builders went up, they built the stairs and the interior. They went all the way to the top, and then they came down and put the outside on as they came down. So, as you climb the stairs to climb the Duomo, which, believe me, is quite an exerted effort, they have all the tools that they would use. So there's these gigantic pulleys and wheels, the materials that they actually used to build this cathedral. It's quite striking. So Brunelleschi is a main architect of the Renaissance. I'll say that again. Brunelleschi is a primary architect of the Renaissance, and he also invented or rediscovered linear perspective. Another primary architect is Alberti. Alberti wrote a series of 12 books on architecture that inspired the likes of Thomas Jefferson and many other architects since his time. Here we can see the sacred geometry, is what they called it, put into play in the facade. This is a rebuilding of a cathedral from the Middle Ages. So architecture was a very important part of the Renaissance, and these are only two of the primary architects. As we go into the Quattrocento, the second half, then we'll look at a few more, like Michelangelo was a great architect. Let's return to our friend who we saw at the beginning, which is Botticelli. Again, I saw this in Florence, and it blew me away. But here we see the mix of the sacred with the mythological, of the Christian sacred with the mythological. This was created for one of the Medici family, and actually was in sort of a back room of his villa. The size is about, I think, 5 by 7 feet, something like that. One more thing to note about this particular painting, it's painted with egg tempera. This is all egg yolk and pigment on a large panel. Since we've already talked about this one, let's move on to Primavera. This was painted a couple of years before he painted The Birth of Venus. And here we have Mars, we have the three graces. We have all sorts of symbolism from mythology. The oranges, they represent abundance. And it's just a really masterful painting that shows the mix of the Christian faith and the ideals of humanism. Here are a few more by the artist Botticelli, who is known to be a really jolly and generous soul. He would give money to younger, poorer artists, and he actually died quite destitute because he was influenced by a monk named Savonarola. But before we look at that, one more thing I want to mention is this is done with egg tempera. All of these paintings, egg yolk and pigment painted on a surface. That is fabulous to consider. I also want you to notice the green tones in his flesh tones. Now let's talk about a dark day in the history of Florence. There was a charismatic monk named Savonarola, and he preached that humanism was sin, that any of the excesses or the spending on the arts was an affront to God. He developed quite a following, and the Medici family actually had to flee Florence for several years. Many of the people who had previously bought the lavish, created the lavish gowns and bought the art, they burned them. They burned their books in a ritual that was called the Bonfire of the Vanities. Now eventually, you could say Savonarola fell on his own sword. He was burned in the very place where they had held the Bonfire of the Vanities earlier. That's in a large square in Florence. So as we wrap up, let's take a quick trip over to Venice. And this is by the artist Bellini, who was from a large family of artists. His father was a well-known artist, but the son didn't actually begin to create art until after his father had died. There's a unique look to the artists of Venice, and this one of St. Francis I find quite beautiful. It's called St. Francis in the Desert, but it looks quite a bit like the area around Assisi where St. Francis lived. Bellini's brother-in-law was a very innovative artist, and that would be Mantegna. When we consider foreshortening, which makes objects appear to come towards us or recede, when we consider the linear perspective, he is a great example of that. Interestingly enough, this was a portal over a bridal chamber, and there's all these cherubs that are just hanging out. There's a peacock, which represents having lots of children and, lots of fertility, shall I say. And then these other people of unknown origin who are looking down into this room. You can see how we also decorated the walls. What Mantegna did is that he decorated the walls to go with the paintings, and that's something that we'll see again in the Baroque era. Now in closing, I want to look at one more by the artist Mantegna. This is called The Lamentation of the Dead Christ, or the Foreshortened Christ. When we think about linear perspective and how you can line up things to look as if they're coming towards us or receding, this is a wonderful example, a powerful painting. But his feet are little teeny feet, because if he would have painted the feet large enough to be realistic, then it would be all feet. So this is an example of an artist putting foreshortening into practice in a way that is quite effective. Our final slide takes us to a whole different part of Europe, right at the end of the era. As Savonarola was about to do his thing, we have the Temptation of St. Anthony. And I've got to say, this is one of the weirdest etchings ever. And I love it. I love it in its weirdness. So here's St. Anthony in the middle, and he is surrounded by all these demons that are trying to tempt him. Look, here's a fish anteater hitting him with a stick. There's like an upside down kind of a demon here pulling at his cloak, at his beard. Somebody else has his cloak. I invite you to stop the video and study this work or look at it in the textbook. So throughout this all, he kept his cool, which I think is a good teaching to all of us. Whatever life throws our way, we just keep our focus on what we're focusing on. So I always like to end with this one because it's just spectacular and the beginning of surrealism. So thanks for listening. More to come.